White House Chief Advisor Steve Bannon has taken the stage. Former, of course, at DA. Let's listen to him.
Agency.
Not a mogul, but...
Yeah, with Jeff Quantnitz. And I never thought, and I bet you didn't either, that you would be an advisor to the White House.
Right. Or we'd end up here.
Or that we'd end up here, exactly. It's great to have you here. Let's start with what is the big news of the week. How do you think the president did in Helsinki on Monday?
I think the president did fine. I mean, I think the hysteria that came from the the opposition party media, the full meltdown, missed the big picture. I mean, David Ignatius, who's no fan of the president, had an article in the Washington Post and said, hey, up until the very last part, when he talked about the meddling and the collusion, it was fine. You know, the president's got a lot at stake in Russia, vis-a-vis China. I think the president's done a terrific job, particularly vis-a-vis all the previous presidents. And I thought the press conference was fine. I would like to be a little stronger, maybe, about the meddling. But at the end of the day, and the Democrats are just going to have to embrace this, the meddling is on the margins, right? It's just not that big a deal. Yeah, the Russians always trying to do something, absolutely, just like the Chinese, right? Just like other of our adversaries and even some of our allies. And so I thought the president, what I didn't like was yesterday. I did not like.
We'll get to that in a second, but hold on one second. Fine? Fine's a strong word, right?
No, fine's actually a weak word.
Fine, I think it's a strong word to describe it, right? I mean, really fine. I saw him in Singapore, and he was very much in command.
Command presence.
And he was not in command on Monday. I mean, that wasn't a fine performance. You really think that?
It's Singapore and Helsinki are two different things. Like I said, I think it was fine. I think the hysteria that came, look, was President Trump in his normal command presence? You could argue yes or no. The topics they discuss, and I think the output that we're getting now, particularly vis-a-vis China, what the president's talking about, I think is quite strong. I think what he's done versus other presidents, look, he goes to Warsaw last year. He gives a speech that he talks about the central part of his administration is defense of Western civilization. And he says at the time he calls them out for the natural gas deal they're going to do with the Germans. Now, any other president, that would have been the most provocative thing in the universe. And look at what the last two presidents did vis-a-vis Russia, right? We've allowed the American foreign policy for 50 years or 60 years was to keep Russia out of the Middle East. Obama allowed that. You know, Bush looked the other way. You know, Brennan and all these super patriots, they're the first to throw treason at the president. You know, where were they when they were on watch about this? Okay? President Obama actually stood down. I think his cybersecurity guy testified at the Senate committee that he stood down. So I don't know where all these super patriots were, and look at what Donald Trump's done. Now, was his command presence as strong as it was in Singapore? The answer is it's certainly no, and I think he'd say the same thing, but it's a different environment. He's dealing with a different guy.
What about the walk back?
But here's the point. The mainstream media jumps on the marginal optics, and they're right on the trigger. It's treason. He didn't support the intelligence community. Let's talk about the intelligence community. You know, all these super patriots, Clapper and Brennan in this crowd, that were jumping on the president because, and the president sometimes conflates, the enabling aspect with the collusion. Okay, the meddling with the
always conflates it. When he's asked about the meddling, he automatically jumps to the accusation of collusion.
The Financial Times of London had on the front page they conflated the two, right? The meddling and the collusion. So a lot of people do it. They're two different things. And certainly the meddling's wrong. We ought to monitor it. They shouldn't do it. We should tell them to shut it down. But President Obama kind of stood down. Those guys are on watch. Really didn't get on it. The indictment on Friday, which President Trump said, hey, go ahead and put the indictment out. I don't have a problem with it. The indictment on Friday didn't even talk about the RNC or the 5 or 6 campaigns that the Russians went after. And let's be frank, if Clapper's book, he's saying, hey, it changed the election. I think it was, what, $100,000 worth of Facebook ads? Give me a break. The meddling was on the margin. Okay, now, in the collusion, they haven't found one shred of evidence. The Democrats wanted a do-over. They have yet to embrace the reason they lost. The reason they lost is they forgot about the working men and women of this country in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Iowa, places Donald Trump never should have won. And they wanted a do-over from 2:30 in the morning on the 9th of November of 2016 when we won, when AP called us the winner. They've wanted a do-over. And they've whined and they've bitched and they've moaned about it since then. And they're going to have a do-over this November. November 6th, they get their do-over.
We're going to get to the midterms in a second. Would you have advised him to go to Helsinki? Would you advise him to sit down with Putin? If you're still at the White House?
The timing would, I thought that the NATO visit, the visit to the United Kingdom and the visit to NATO could have taken place on November 7th.
After the midterms.
There's plenty to do there. There's plenty that you have to do. I thought his trip to NATO was fantastic. We can get into that in a second. Talking to our allies, trying to save NATO. Donald Trump's done more than any president of the United States, not to have happy talk, but actually try to save NATO and make it a real alliance, not a protectorate. All that could have waited. We could have waited to after November 6th. They want to do it, fine. It's going to be fine. The deplorables will be plenty jacked up. We'll get there in a second. But that visit, if you take the whole totality of it, look what he did with NATO. I mean, Donald Trump is trying to save this alliance. What he doesn't want is a protectorate. Remember, the problem we've got ourselves in this liberal post-war rules-based order, and if you go from Europe to the Persian Gulf to the South China Sea to Northwest Pacific, it's a series of commercial relationships, capital markets, trade relationships, and American security guarantees. We underwrite the whole thing. If you want to know why we have a structural deficit of $1 trillion a year, it's because we underwrite the entire thing. None of our allies kick into the till. And the Europeans are the worst. And Germany's the worst of the entire lot. So they can't sit there and tell me what a big threat they think Russia is when 15% of the German people don't want to pay 2%. Now, this is what is very important about NATO. Trump goes over there, and he's been talking to Stoltenberg, the Secretary General, the entire time. And Stoltenberg has said that Trump is the biggest reason we now have people putting in. That 2%, originally supposed to be 2024. Trump, as a business guy, says, hey, it's got to be 2%. It's got to be now, because we're spending essentially $1 trillion. I know it's $800 billion, but $1 trillion.
And he wants past due interest.
And he says, like a landlord, hey, if you don't make the 2%, you got to make an arrears. And they're going crazy. He just logical. Now, the readiness initiative that Trump initiates to say, what's the interoperability, where's the equipment? Because Trump looks at the numbers under the hood. And he says, hey, this 1.2% they're paying, the use of proceeds is on global warming, healthcare. Where's the equipment? Where's the interoperability? Germans have 128 combat aircraft, 7 can get airborne. The entire Germany can put up 1 brigade of combat troops. So he says, readiness initiative. He comes out of the afternoon meeting. He says, hey, how about this? 2% now, in no 10 years now, and 4% total. We're at 4%. We can't continue this. And here's the reason. We're not an empire. We're looking for allies. We're not looking for protectorates. Europe is a protectorate right now. What Donald Trump is trying to force them to do by having a partners conversation is to say, you've got to be a partner. You have to be in on this thing. And I think it's very logical. And you've seen a lot of the globalists over there kind of push back on it, but I think Trump has been the guy that's trying to save this alliance.
I want to exhaust Helsinki because then I want to get on to China.
By the way, Helsinki, and the Stoltenberg breakfast, let's go back to the breakfast. With Stoltenberg, he's lighting Stoltenberg up in the morning, right? He's saying, you're not paying 2%, he says you're the best thing. Then he starts talking about the natural gas deal. He says if they sign the natural gas deal, they can have 70% ultimately control of their energy. And he says, well, we trade with Russia all the time. He says, and Trump says, it's not about trade. This is about geopolitics. And remember, Merkel never wanted to bring that up when this deal was going. So he is so hard, from an alliance point of view, vis-a-vis Russia. The hardest I've seen since I was in the Pentagon back in the 80s.
So explain this to me then.
Yeah.
I think he likes Putin. It appears to me he likes Putin.
I think he gravitates to personalities that are strong personalities. He likes President Xi. He likes Erdogan, who I think is the most dangerous guy in the world. And I think he's attracted to Putin because I think he looks at those people as strong leaders of countries. They're nationalists. They put their countries first, and they get on with it, and they don't care what other people think.
Doesn't bother you he's attracted to those people?
No. Doesn't.
Why not?
It doesn't. I tell you why. Because he's got his own house style. If you look at what he does, he leads from strength. Okay? People criticize, this guy doesn't know what he's doing, doesn't understand this. If you see what he's doing around the world, to reorient this rules-based post-war liberal order that could not continue on and has essentially worked to deindustrialize the United States. It's on the backs of the deplorables. They're the ones that pay the taxes to underwrite it, and it's their kids in the Hindu Kush, it's their kids in the South China Sea, it's their kids in the 38th parallel. That's the deplorable speaking. And I think Trump has a very strong vision of what America First means. This is the other thing about engagement. You know, all the liberals and all the guys on Morning Joe every day talk about isolationism and all that. He's the least isolated president ever. If you look at not just the inaugural address, if you look at the Riyadh summit, where we actively engaged our allies, our Sunni Arab allies, particularly in the Gulf. And then if you look at the Warsaw speech, which to me was one of the most provocative speeches against Russia ever, I think that this guy is the last thing of being an isolationist. In addition, I think we got to keep Russia in perspective. Russia's an annoyance. China is our great challenge, as you've heard today with folks talking about China. Russia's economy is the size of what, Texas or New York State? It's, what, 70% dependent on natural resources. It's got lots of nuclear weapons, but in today's modern warfare, okay, when you talk about cyber, you talk about information warfare, economic warfare, and kinetic, guns up, nuclear weapons have taken less and less of an important role in the reality of what warfare is. And so I think Trump puts it in perspective, and I think that's what he's doing with, what he's trying to do is end the Cold War. Okay, he's trying to end the Cold War. The great geniuses of both political parties blew an opportunity in the 1990s to bring this thing to an end. And we've had to pay a price for it ever since then. What Donald Trump is trying to do is end the Korean War in the Korean Peninsula and end the Cold War. And all he's getting is grief from the globalists.
Let's talk about China.
Okay.
We've talked about China all day, about whether or not there's going to be a trade war. What we see happening, game this out for us. Where does this go? How does it end?
We're not at this thing of a trade war. They've been in a trade war with us for 25 or 30 years. But we're at war with China. Ray Dalio, he tweeted it the other day. We're at war with China. There's three types of war. The Chinese look at it. Information war, economic war, and guns up, kinetic war. They're been at economic war with us for 25 years. No great power in world history has ever looked away of their greatest threat and at the same time dissipated its energy on something. We spent $7 trillion. Brown University, the Watson Center, shown we spent $7 trillion in 17 years on this war on terror and the war in the Middle East, right, with very bad outcomes. And we've allowed the rise of China. In fact, many people in this room, the elites of our country, have exacerbated the rise of China. And we were told time and time again until Donald Trump got here that it was the inexorable rise of China. It was the second law of thermodynamics. This was a law of physics in the natural world. In fact, the whole Thucydides trap concept that Kissinger, these guys came up with, is based on the rising power and declining power. We're the declining power. That's the same theory they had before Ronald Reagan got here in the 1970s, that Russia and the Soviet Union was on the rise and we were on decline. That was what détente was about. That was what all the arms agreements were about. Ronald Reagan changed that, said we can defeat these guys. We can bring this down. And it was supposed to be 40 years. It happened in 8 or 10 years. Same thing with Donald Trump. And he's mocked and ridiculed of not being some foreign policy expert. He's got enough understanding of the world and the way the world works to go after this. And quite frankly, we're winning. They talk about the Chinese haven't come back to us with a response in the trade thing. For the first time in the last 25 years, they don't know what to do. They're seeing an opponent that's standing up for themselves. It's not just the trade. The trade it's the scale and depth of the trade. And the way Trump proposes, he says it's 50, it's 200, it's supposed to be 100, it's 200, and it's another 200 if you retaliate. And by the way, if you even retaliate again, it may be another 500. You know, he's talking about right now $500 billion. That's just one. The 301s is what Silicon Valley came to us about. It's not the technology theft. It's the forced technology transfers. The third part's the ZTE, where we can basically implode these companies. The last is the
I'm trying to game this out. So
here's the game. Right now, we're converging on a point, and they understand this. We could take the whole thing down. We could take the whole thing's built on a house of sand.
What if they sell our treasuries? What if they devalue their currency?
They devalue their currency. They're just going to flood more dollars out. They got $3 trillion of reserves, and trust me, in a New York second, that thing would flood out of the country in a second. That's what their own people think about their economy. We've allowed these guys to push us around. We've allowed these guys to take the South China Sea. When I was 22 years old as an ensign, JG in the Navy, it's central of the South China Sea to be free and open navigation. the Bush administration and the Obama administration. Look the other day when they militarized it. It was Donald Trump that said.
I hear all that, but I want to talk about where the trade war is going.
Well, I don't. By the way, I think right now.
How does it end?
I think.
So you heard the previous panel,
How
right?
it ends is in victory. How it ends is in victory. Donald Trump is not going to back off this. The Chinese are going to blink right now.
What is victory?
Victory is when they give us full access to their markets. Victory is when they stop. Remember, the warlordism in China right now, and Xi is under, I think, tremendous pressure, is the state-owned industries. Remember, China, Made in China 2025, they told us it was to leapfrog us and to converge on advanced chip design, robotics, and artificial intelligence, to converge eventually with genetics, to converge on advanced manufacturing. What the reality is we saw in GTE is to get off the West supply chain for ZTE.
Yeah.
Get off ZTE was to get off the West supply chain for components. I think the number one thing you're going to see out of the trade war is the reorientation of the complete supply chain of Japan, Western Europe, and the United States and Southeast Asia, that 800 million people, even before you get to India, okay, around the freedom-loving countries. I think the regime in China is in deep trouble. Remember, this is different than the Chinese people. The Chinese people are some of the hardest working and best people in the world. It's this regime that has led them down this path, and it's this cult of personality around Xi that tried to get up in the United States' face. This trade war is going to end in victory, and what you're going to see is a reorientation of the entire supply chain out of China.
We discuss it in far simpler terms on CNBC frequently. It's when it's all said and done, are there going to be fewer tariffs in the world? Is China going to be more open, or is it going to be less open?
Let's go back to the G7 for a second. It's just not tariffs. It's all the barriers. G7 on the first day, he got lit up, right? Lit up by everybody. The worst guy in the world. They're over the bending over the thing. Next morning, he walks in there, says, "Hey, I got an idea. How about this idea? How about no tariffs? No tariffs whatsoever. Raw trade, reciprocity, no tariffs."
Yeah, Larry Kudlow brought that up this morning.
Hold on. But no subsidies. Macron didn't know what to do. Couldn't get out of a seat. Look. The whole scam is their state-owned industries. Brexit and 2016 are inextricably linked. What links them is China. It's China's exporting its deflation and Chinese exporting its excess capacity that has gutted the Midland heartlands of England, obviously through Germany, but and gutted the upper Midwest of the United States. If you go out to the Midwest and you give them a fire-breathing speech on China, you don't have to get them up to speed like you do the elites in New York. They understand it. J.D. Vance, who wrote Hillbilly Elegies, reminded me that these studies from MIT and Harvard showed there's a direct correlation between the factories that went overseas, the billets and jobs that went with them, and the opioid crisis. Remember, tariffs are not just about economics, and they're just not about manufacturing jobs. It is about self-worth and identity and people understanding they have jobs, okay? This is bringing these manufacturing jobs back.
Good for the economy?
100% good for the economy. Great for the economy.